It was as though time had frozen, as we all stared at the eye, and it stared back at us. Perhaps I should have taken that moment to make a break for it, to run away, but my head was still pounding from the blow I had taken, and besides, I was so dizzy I could barely stand, much less run. Instead, I could only squirm, giving a half-hearted attempt to break free that I knew would never work, but felt obliged to try. Jehu easily restrained me, even with only one hand, and even took the effort to reach down with his other one and pull away my duct tape bandage, revealing the terrible fingers, along with a gasp of pain from me. Perhaps, if they had searched more, they could have found the other aberrations on my body as well, but it seemed like those two were more than enough for them.
What the fuck?
I heard a male voice say, and it took a moment to realize that it was Legion's. Those were the first words he had ever spoken in my presence. The woman gasped in horror and disgust, but the only one I could look towards was Hagar, hoping against hope that she would be understanding. But she was trying to push away from me now with the help of the other woman. She got up from her fetal position and they were both now trying to make distance, staring at me the whole time like they didn't dare take their eyes off of me. Even in the dark and in my confused state, I could see several fresh cuts and bruises all over what exposed skin Hagar had out, as well as a black eye already beginning to form. She looked up as I was being dragged away, fear and anger and confusion in her eyes, even as tears ran down them, and I felt like I had to say something, to try to explain myself, to explain what was happening. I tried to speak, not even knowing what I was really going to say, but only a strange gurgling came out. Maybe I was hit on the head harder than I thought. It didn't matter. It was clear that my little secret was out. There was no hiding it anymore. I peered towards Mother, hoping for guidance. It seemed that at the very least, she was no longer content to just be a silent watcher, but seemed to be actively saying something. Unfortunately, I heard nothing, only silence as she continued to speak. It was clear that she was trying to say the same few words over and over again, but what they were, I could not tell. Her perfect, straight white teeth flashed, her lush red lips pressed together, but still, I could not understand her. If only I could be as powerful as her, as in command as her. But never had I felt more weak, more vulnerable than in this moment. All I could do was shake my head at her, trying to tell her I didn't understand, but she just kept saying those unknown words, over and over. Jehu, seeming to notice my head shake, peered at where I was looking, but apparently saw nothing, even though Mother was sitting right there.
I don't know what you're trying to do, or even what you are, but I promise you, it's not going to work.
He hissed at me, drawing me further back, away from Mother, away from my dress, away from my flock, from my authority, from everything. I felt tears running down my cheeks as I thought about all that I was losing, but I couldn't do anything about it. I could barely even stand.
You're going back to the apartments, and we're going to show everyone whatever this is,
he continued, gesturing at my now covered up fingers and eyes on my torso, either not noticing or caring about my anguish.
And you're going to have to listen to what everyone has to say about you, and what they think we should do with you. No more running off. No more, what will you do for me? You're going to listen, and listen good. And then, well, who knows what happens next. But you won't be in charge. I can tell you that much. Everyone is going to see how much of a freak you really are. You will,
do, do you smell something? Like cotton candy? The wall behind us suddenly exploded. Jehu was flung away from me, and once again I found myself sprawled down on the floor, only narrowly avoiding smacking my head into a shelf and probably passing out. As it was, I cried out in pain as my arm connected with the floor with a harsh smack, and I could swear I heard something break as I collapsed to the ground. I think my arm just snapped. But no time to worry about that, because a strange gurgling noise behind me demanded my attention, and with great effort, I managed to rotate my body to get a look at what had caused this sudden interruption. My vision was blurry, and it was hard to concentrate, so it took me longer than normal to understand what I was even looking at. But somehow, I suspected that even if I was in perfect health, I would have had trouble comprehending the thing that towered above me. The first thing I noticed were its legs, all the dozen of them. They sprouted from its body like a terrible spider, except spiders only have 8. They scurried back and forth constantly, red and raw, but with them ending in feet that were covered in a hard, glossy substance. I think it might have been the stuff that fingernails are made out of, keratin. Whatever it was, it skittered and smacked against the hard floor of the store, smashing and knocking over anything that dared to stand in its path. But that was only the beginning of the beast. Its body was relatively mundane, as far as these things went, just a large sphere, though it was still as red and stripped of skin as any of the other creatures had been. It was huge, perhaps 20 feet in circumference, so big that it was barely able to squeeze itself into the store with us, with the top of its grotesque body scraping against the ceiling. In the center of this body was a huge mouth, constantly opening and closing as it seemed to gnash at the air, and inside I could see rows and rows of teeth. It reminded me, in a way, of a picture I once saw of a sea turtle's mouth, with its many rows of sharp teeth on the inside. But this thing's mouth was instead lined with what had to be hundreds of flat molars, all of them constantly scraping and smashing against one another. Even as I watched, I saw that when the thing turned to look to the right, it caused 2 teeth to smash into a third, crushing it between them and turning it into an explosion of shrapnel that the beast seemed to either not notice or simply care about. The constant noise from this thing's mouth was horrendous, like nothing I'd ever heard before, and could only be compared to listening to someone grind their teeth, multiplied by 1,000. I tried to draw my hands up to cover my ears, but found myself unable to move my left arm without intense shooting pain, probably because of the fall. Instead, I could only continue to look up at the beast and try to take it all in. Of its eyes, there was not much to say, because, as far as I could tell, it had none. But I think it didn't really need them, thanks to the real star of the show. You see, what I had been describing up until now was just the main body of this creature, but what really made it stand out from its grisly companions that I had already seen and heard about was what was coming off of it. Out of its back, of course, was the giant tube that led back the way it came, as every single one of these creatures seemed to have, that I still had no understanding of, with this particular appendage having to be at least a good foot in diameter. But this creature also had much smaller tubes bursting out of its sides, the left right in front of it, at least 10 of them in an asymmetrical pattern, and from each of these tubes they led to another, smaller beast that was probably only about 3 feet in height, barely taller than a child. It was hard to get a proper look at these smaller beasts, with how fast and erratically they moved, but they seemed to only have 6 legs, 3 on each side, and much smaller feet than the larger one. Their general body shape was the same as the parent creature they were attached to, but notably, they had no mouths to speak of, instead having a single, giant eye where the mouth was on the larger one, rolling and staring at anything and everything in a mad frenzy. They darted around the store, constantly slamming into walls, the shelves, each other, anything really. They climbed up and over anything that stood in their way as though it wasn't even there, and even as I watched, one reached the end of how far the tube that connected it to the larger beast could stretch, causing it to suddenly snap back and fall to the ground in a tangled heap. It only laid there a moment, however, before quickly jumping back to its feet and resuming its mad dashing, always running and going nowhere. It was insanity. I could barely keep up. The smaller creatures running everywhere, the larger one knocking things over and letting out that terrible noise from its mouth. It was all far too overwhelming for my already rattled mind. And to top it all off, The entire place was now insanely smelling of candy and salt, causing even more confused mixed signals to my brain. I started desperately trying to crawl away, broken arm or not, dragging myself forward across the broken glass and sharp metal on the ground, no care as to the cuts they were carving into my body from such an action. I had to get out of here. Unfortunately, it seemed that my movement attracted the attention of one of the smaller beasts, for I saw its single, unblinking eye suddenly snap to me as I crawled forward. It of course made no noise, for it didn't have a mouth, but it suddenly leaped towards me, clearing at least 10 feet in a single jump and landing directly in front of me. I gasped for air and tried to turn direction and get away from it, but looking back I saw only the larger beast behind me, cutting off the only other path to go. Once again, I was hemmed in, and I found myself really hating this aisle. This close up, I could see that it was covered in a thick layer of slime, just like the one from back when we were traversing through the city. It glistened and sparkled as the thing stared at me, and I found that I could only stare back. I had no weapon, nobody to help me. I was even down an arm. Its single giant eye peered at me, and I could have almost sworn that I saw something in it, a glimmer of intelligence, like peering into a murky pool of water and seeing the barest hint of a fish swimming at the bottom of it. I pleaded to this thing then, in my mind at least, begging it to let me go, to let me return to my rightful place as leader, to let me be. But if it heard my silent cries, it gave no sign, just continuing to stare down at me, looking at me like it was a kid walking in the rain, and I was a worm they had suddenly spied on the sidewalk. It suddenly pinched me with its front two legs, grabbing me with its sticky residue and lifting me up over its head. The slime was cold and thoroughly unpleasant to the touch, but any disgust from that was quickly crowded out by the shooting pain that raced through my entire body from the sudden movement. I wanted to scream, but found that I could only lamely gasp for air instead as the thing carried me down to the end of the aisle, back to its larger leader. It approached its apparent master, like the way one's child approaches their parent, after they ask them to grab them something from the kitchen. Only instead of it being a simple measuring cup or a wooden spoon, I was the prize. The larger one gurgled and gasped, seemingly pleased with this, and it reached out a limb itself, many times larger than the entire thing that held me in its arms. It pressed against me, sticking me with the same sickening slime that oozed out of the smaller creatures, and lifted me straight up, suspending me with nothing but the sheer strength of the mucus-like substance. My mind went to the men who attempted to swing their weapons into the beasts that had attacked us in the streets, and how their weapons had become stuck in the coating almost instantly. It really was an impressive defense mechanism if you thought about it. I would have been impressed if I wasn't the one stuck in its clutches. It lifted me, up, 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 up above the aisle of the store, so high up that if I wasn't pinned down, I could have reached up and touched the ceiling. With this new vantage point, I was able to look back to the other end of the store and see how the rest of my little group was doing. The two men, Jehu and Legion, were attempting to fight off the rest of the smaller creatures with their weapons while making their way to the exit of the building, to limited success. Maybe they would be able to hold them off long enough to escape. Maybe not. I hoped they didn't. I hoped they died. The other woman, whose name I didn't know and now looked like I never would, was hiding behind the counter with Hagar, both of them peeking out over the fox granite slab to watch what was going on. And seemingly, still unnoticed by all except myself, was Mother, still sitting in her perfect way, still watching all of this with seemingly detached interest. She was still mouthing something at me, but I couldn't, for the life of me, figure out what it was. So instead I turned my gaze to Hagar, who was no longer looking up at me. I spoke then, to her, and I begged. For the first time in my life, I begged someone for something, despite all my pride and grandeur and need to always seem strong. I had nothing else left, so I begged. Please, I whispered to her. Please help. But she didn't respond, didn't even move out from behind the counter. In her scared face, blackening even more from the bruises that my own 2 hands had inflicted on her, was the last thing I saw before I was shoved into the monster's terrible, rancid mouth. And then the only thing I saw was blackness. And it was true that I could only see blackness, but I could still feel, not that that was a good thing. I could feel it unceremoniously scrape me off of the slime with its many rows of flat molars, the same way one might scrape a popcorn kernel out from their teeth. I could feel my body descend, descend, descend into ever deeper darkness. And I could feel the way it didn't chew, but instead swallowed me whole and intact. An intentional choice, I am sure. I felt myself fall deeper and deeper into the beast, compressed on all sides by hot, wet flesh for what seemed to be at least an hour, barely able to breathe, until I finally hit a liquid that burned me like the hottest fire to ever ignite, that seared my skin from my bone and caused it to drip off like a perfectly cooked rib fresh off the grill. I would have screamed if I had any air in my lungs. As it was, the moment I opened my mouth, the liquid rushed in there too, and the pain was so immense, I'm really not sure how I didn't pass out. My last conscious thought was of that man I sent tumbling into that pit of acid in that room made of flesh so long ago. I wondered if his experience felt anything like this. And then, agony.